All right, welcome back everybody to another lecture here in History 1301. And today's topic we're going to be going over the War of 1812, which really overlaps a lot of what we were talking about last time when we were in lecture. But anyways, what we started to see develop during the Jefferson administration is he had to deal, just like what we'd seen with the Washington and Adams administration, he had to deal with issues with foreign powers, most notably with both Great Britain and France, as both of those powers were at war with one another in the so-called Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s. But anyways, as they were waging war against one another, they wanted to ensure that no other nation could trade with the other power, and they began to issue policies like the Orders in Council, as well as Napoleon's Continental System, to bar mainly neutral nations from being able to trade with the other power. And this led the British to begin that policy that we had briefly mentioned before last time of impressment, to where they would seize American ships, seize their cargo that was bound for France, and impress any sailor they believed was a British subject into the British Navy, especially as there was a high demand for sailors with the outbreak of war within Europe. But it will be through this policy of impressment, and as we'll see here in just a moment, with Native American raids out on the frontier, that would slowly lead the United States to go off to war in 1812. Now, the origins of the conflict for the War of 1812 date back to the Jefferson administration during the first decade of the 1800s. And those same issues that we had talked about last time that led him to impose the Embargo Act, those same issues, those same violation of American sailing rights, will continue into the next administration under James Madison, and he will inherit this mess and he will have to address the issue. However, as the British were unwilling to step down from pushing forth their Orders in Council and this policy of impressment, the Americans, tensions between them as well as the British were continuing to mount. And by 1810 and 1811, a group known as the Warhawks, which were mainly young politicians, a new generation of politicians like Henry Clay as well as John C. Calhoun, were actively calling for America to go off to war. And it's no surprise by June of 1812 that Madison would have to give in, and he realized that the only prospect was for the U.S. to declare war, and he would issue an address to Congress basically calling on them to declare war against Britain for their violation of their shipping rights. Meanwhile, out on the frontier, what's also going to douse the fire is going to be that of Native American raids. Now, out on the western frontier in the northwestern states of Indiana, or what would become Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, we see that there was an ongoing struggle between American settlers as well as the Native American tribes of that region, most notably a Native American group that was under control or under the command of one Tecumseh, who had a vision of creating a pan-Indian alliance that would stretch all the way from the border of Canada down to the Gulf Coast, that would unite under one banner to fight against American settlement and their lands. Now, unfortunately for Tecumseh, this won't come into being, but with his involvement out on the frontier in 1810 and 1811 against American settlers, it would also contribute to why Americans wanted to go to war with Great Britain, because Tecumseh himself was being supplied by the British. And once we see the Battle of Tippecanoe take place in November of 1811, and it becomes clear that the British had supplied weapons to Tecumseh, this would add further fuel for the calls to war. And by June of 1812, America, for the first time in its history, will declare war on another nation. Now, ironically, though, the same day that Congress declares war against Great Britain, an ocean away, back over in London, British Parliament is going to issue a proclamation of reconciliation with the United States, to where they will agree to stop violating American shipping rights, drop this policy of impressment to avoid a conflict with the United States, because they were still busy and preoccupied with fighting with Napoleon. However, as we have mentioned before in class, it takes time for a word of either this declaration of war or this notion of reconciliation to arrive across the Atlantic. And when the declaration of war arrives over in London, the British are basically going to wait for the Americans to respond to their own proclamation of reconciliation, and likewise when that proclamation of reconciliation arrives over in the American nation, the Americans are also going to wait for the British response to their declaration of war. So technically speaking, this war kind of begins in a very odd way. But even though it begins in an odd way, it will quickly engulf much of the continent. And it will truly be a continental war very similar to what we had seen with the American Revolution. Now, before I start talking about the different theaters of war that will be fought within the War of 1812, I'm not going to focus too much on the battles that occur within this conflict. I'm just going to generally talk about the events that had occurred in each respective region of the country during this conflict. If you would like to look at more on the battles in your own time, that's on you. However, today we're just going to be focusing how this is going to impact the ultimate outcome of the war. But anyways, the conflict will come to engulf the entire continent. We'll see that most of the fighting from the beginning to the end of the conflict will be waged along the U.S.-Canadian border. It's still important for us to recognize that the nation of Canada, as it is today, was still under British control back in 1812. Now, this region of the war will also become the so-called Canadian-American War, because many of those who will be doing the fighting on the British side will be Canadian citizens. Some of them are former Americans, many of them are former Loyalists, as well as French, German, and other immigrant groups that had arrived over in Canada in the previous decades. And even though the Americans will have the assumption that the Canadians want to be a part of America, when the Americans do invade Canada early on in the conflict, the Canadians are going to put up heavy resistance. They're not going to see the Americans as liberators, but rather as invaders, and they will repel the Americans from penetrating deep into Canada. Now, at points, Americans will capture towns like York, as well as several other Canadian towns, but for the most part, Canada would remain in British control for much of the conflict. Now, much of the fighting that will take place around Canada will also take place out on the Great Lakes. Now, the Great Lakes were the key to basically whoever would control Canada. If you controlled the Great Lakes, you controlled the trade, you controlled the supply routes, and so on and so forth. And by 1813, we'll see both the British as well as the American Navy are going to begin to construct their own fleets out on the high seas. And eventually the Americans, even though they were ill-prepared for this conflict, even though they had virtually no navy out on, say, the Atlantic Ocean, they would be able to construct enough ships on the Great Lakes to confront the British on equal terms. And the Americans will gain control over the Great Lakes very early on, or I should say about midway through the conflict in the summer of 1813. And the war slowly starts to turn for the Americans, but even trying to get troops into Canada will prove to be a very difficult task. And it won't be until 1814 that the Americans will gain some, I guess you could say, significant victories. Meanwhile, as fighting was raging in Canada, it's also going to rage in the American South, to where we see basically a side conflict take place in the southern states, and where we would recognize today as Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and parts of Georgia, and what is called the so-called Creek War. Now, down in the American Southern Theater during the War of 1812, it's not necessarily going to be the Americans and the British battling it out here. Now, the British will be behind some of the supplies to these Native American tribes, but it's mostly going to be between American settlers and the Creek Nation. Now, the Creek Nation itself, by 1813, was heavily divided. It was actually engulfed in a mini-civil war, if you will, by this point, mainly because of that earlier Shawnee warrior I had mentioned, that of Tecumseh. Now, Tecumseh, he had that vision of creating a pan-Indian alliance, and in 1810 and 1811, he would come down south to try to get the 5 civilized tribes, which included the Creek Nation, to side with him against the Americans. And the Creek Nation was heavily divided on whether or not they would support Tecumseh. Half of them, known as the Upper Creeks or the Red Stick Indians, are going to support getting involved on Tecumseh's side of joining a pan-Indian alliance and confronting the Americans and not allowing them to encroach upon their ancestral homelands. Meanwhile, the other group of Creek Indians, that of the Lower Creeks, who would be supported by the United States, they want to coexist with the United States because they see that as the best prospect to retaining their land. A civil war would emerge between these two rival factions in the Creek Nation, and it wouldn't be long before the United States gets involved in the Creek War. First, we'll see an atrocity that will take place at Fort Mens, to where roughly about 200 American settlers, white and black, man, woman, and children, are going to be massacred by the Red Stick tribes. And after that, a man by the name of Andrew Jackson is going to offer up his services to raise an army, mostly of Tennesseans, but also of Kentuckians, as well as other individuals from around the South, to wage a war against the Creeks, utterly destroy that nation, and kick them out of northern Alabama as well as southern Tennessee. He will raise an army of about 2,500 men and begin to march southward, where by May of 1814 he would confront the Creek Nation in basically the climactic battle of this little war at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Long story short, Jackson, as well as the American forces, with their Cherokee and Creek allies, are going to defeat the Upper Creeks. And after that, he will force the entire Creek Nation, Upper and Lower Creeks alike, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, which would force them to cede over all of their land throughout Mississippi and Alabama and parts of Tennessee over to the United States. And this will begin it will foreshadow events that come with Jackson to where he'd become infamous with the Indian removal policies a little bit later on. But anyways, after the Treaty of Fort Jackson, fighting in the South will begin to die down. However, it's not going to completely evaporate, as we'll see here in just a moment. But anyways, as the Creek War begins to die down, it comes at perhaps the worst possible moment for the Americans, because at that same moment that we see the Battle of Horseshoe Bend being fought, over in Europe, events are going to dictate the future course of this war. By the end of May of 1814, Napoleon had been captured and defeated. War was over for the time being, and this will free up the entire British Army as well as the entire British Navy to, if they wanted to, come over to the American continents. And by the middle of 1814, because of these developments, tens of thousands of British soldiers would be bound on ships coming over to the Americas to hopefully turn the tide of the War of 1812. And their target is going to be the Atlantic coast, particularly along the Chesapeake Bay. The reason they're going to, well, first off, before we talk about why they're going to target the Chesapeake Bay, by April of 1814, we do start to see that the British are going to take advantage of their naval superiority. While the Americans had won some battles on the Great Lakes, the American Navy out in the Atlantic Ocean was basically non-existent. And the British Navy, the largest navy in the world at the time, it will be free to basically attack any point along the Atlantic coast that it chooses. And by April of 1814, they were conducting raids all up and down the Atlantic coast, harassing cities like Baltimore, like Philadelphia, and we'll see here Washington, D.C. here in a second. But anyways, by August of 1814, they will ramp up their raids into an actual invasion, which they hoped would accomplish two things. One, they wanted to invade the Chesapeake Bay region, march on Washington, D.C., and by doing so, they were hoping that American troops from the U.S.-Canadian border would begin to come to the capital's defense, relieving the Canadian front. And also, they were hopeful that if they captured Washington, D.C., it proved to be a great humiliation to where the United States wouldn't be able to recover, and they would have to hand over major concessions to the British, and perhaps even create discontent that might break up entirely the United States. And so by August 19th of 1814, about 4,400 British soldiers are going to land at Benedict, Maryland, with their target being that of Washington, D.C. Over the course of the next week, they will march on the capital, and there was virtually nobody in their way to stop them from capturing the nation's capital. Now, Madison himself is going to call up the raising of militia, and while he will get sufficient militiamen to take up arms, and while the Americans will outnumber the British, remember, militia are not professional soldiers, and they will not be able to stand toe-to-toe with the professional soldiers in the British Army. And at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th, they will just basically almost give up without a fight, leaving the pathway open for the British Army to march into Washington, D.C., which they will take advantage of. And on that night, as well as the following morning, the British Army would march through the streets of the nation's capital and burn it to the ground. Now, they're only going to burn the public buildings like the White House, as well as the Capitol building and the and the Treasury. But they will spare many of the privately owned buildings, including the Patent Office. However, that night on August 24th, as the flames were engulfing the White House, a storm will take place, and it's just going to suck up all those flames and put them onto basically every building that we see throughout the city. And Washington would be burned to the ground. It would be a great humiliation for the nation, and perhaps it could lead to the collapse of their cause. However, this would prove to actually be a rallying point for many Americans. While some were distraught and their morale was destroyed after the fall of Washington, when James Madison issued out a call for the Americans to repel the invaders, tens of thousands of individuals motivated to avenge the capital are going to join their militia looking to confront the British before they attack the next major town, that of Baltimore. Now, it's important for us to recognize, too, at this point, the war, which the Americans believed would be an easy one at the outset of it, was going against them. And where it had started almost as a war of conquest when they had tried to invade Canada at the beginning of the conflict, it was now a conflict for their very survival. And by this point, many Americans were beginning to associate this as their second war for independence, a fight for their survival. Now, the British Army, after burning Washington to the ground, will march northwards towards Baltimore. Now, Baltimore was more significant than D.C. because it was a major trading town, and they were hoping to go into that town, damage up all the ports to where it would significantly hinder American trade for the foreseeable future. However, when they arrive outside of Baltimore, the Americans were prepared. They had a heavily defended fort at Fort McHenry that would hold out even despite a constant British bombardment. And it will be at this battle before Fort McHenry that Francis Scott Key, outside of the Baltimore Harbor, would write the Star-Spangled Banner. And if you think of the Star-Spangled Banner today and you listen to it at a ball game or whatever the case may be, the words he's describing of the rocket's red glare is describing the battle that was taking place outside of Baltimore. But anyways, Fort McHenry itself, it will not fall, and neither will Baltimore. And it completely thwarts British efforts and British plans. And it effectively somewhat turns the tide of the war. Around the same time that we see the Battle of Fort McHenry take place and end in an American victory, back over on the U.S.-Canadian border, the U.S. Navy as well as the U.S. Army is going to gain a significant victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh, winning both by land as well as by sea. Not to mention, at the same time, we'll even see that Jackson, after winning the Creek War, will march southward and prevent the British from landing in Pensacola, Florida, with the goal, perhaps, of taking Florida. And these events are going to greatly alter what was beginning to take place over in Europe. Because even before we see the British invade the Atlantic coast, the Americans as well as British diplomats had agreed to meet at a small Belgian town by the name of Ghent to begin to discuss negotiations to bring about an end to the conflict. Now, at first, when the British diplomats hear word of the burning of Washington, it looks like the Americans are going to have to make major concessions to end the war. However, with the news of the Battle of Fort McHenry as well as the Battle of Plattsburgh, this completely changes the nature of the peace negotiations. And the Treaty of Ghent will finally be signed on December 24th, which will have a somewhat favorable peace for both powers. It's going to restore what's known as the status quo ante bellum, basically restoring things to as they had been before the war. So what would happen with this idea of status quo ante bellum is that both powers, if they had gained any territory at all, they had to give that territory back over to the power that had it before the outbreak of this conflict. They'd also agreed to release all prisoners of war and begin to demobilize from the region. And virtually through the Treaty of Ghent, the war was a draw. But nonetheless, on December 24th, 1814, the war had come to its conclusion. But even though the peace treaty was signed on December 24th, it will take months for it to arrive back over in the United States. And in that time, we're going to see two significant events are going to begin to take shape that could threaten eventually the outcome of the War of 1812. So the first of those two events that will occur before the arrival of news of the Treaty of Ghent arrives over in the United States would be that of the Battle of New Orleans. Now, after the British had failed to arrive in Pensacola, their main site was actually the town of New Orleans. Now, the reason the British want to take New Orleans is because, one, it dominates the Mississippi River and it can control trade within the region. And they were hoping that if they captured this city and took control of trade along the Mississippi River, Western Americans would want to appeal for peace. Meanwhile, also, if they captured New Orleans, it could prove to be a springboard for them to launch attacks into the American South and begin to carve up American territory. So those were the two main goals for the British when they wanted to capture New Orleans. And British soldiers will arrive by the end of December of 1814, around the same time that we see the Treaty of Ghent signed, and they will be confronted by an American army. It will number about 4,500 men under the command of our old friend Andrew Jackson, who arrived in the city before the British and began to set up his own defenses. Now, Andrew Jackson himself, Old Hickory as he was affectionately called by his men, he would begin to construct trenches. And for those of you that don't know what a trench is, it's basically a ditch within the ground. It would provide his troops, mostly militiamen, with cover, and the only way to attack them was from the front. And the British soldiers are going to run into this trap, and on January 8th, 1815, about the same number of British troops are going to launch an attack head-on into his entrenchments, and it's going to end in a disaster. It will be a massive American victory. New Orleans would remain in American hands, and with it, the British would be expelled from their invasion, I guess you could say, of the American South. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, though, why are we talking about this battle compared to all the other ones of the War of 1812, especially since it took place after the Treaty of Ghent? Is this just a meaningless battle? Well, it's not. The Battle of New Orleans is very significant, ultimately, for the outcome of the War of 1812. Now, while peace had been declared, let's say the British had captured the city of New Orleans. There's a possibility that the British, upon hearing of this capture, may not have wanted to get about the city, and perhaps they would have renewed the war. And so, this was a very important victory for the Americans, especially psychologically, and it was important to ensure that the war would come to a conclusion. So no, it's not an insignificant bloodbath that we see occur after the signing of the peace treaty. However, around this same time as we see the Battle of New Orleans, there's also going to be another major battle, but not a major battle in the military sense, but one in the political sense. Because up in the American Northeast, in the New England states, we start to see that there was major discontent that was beginning to boil over that perhaps could threaten America's involvement within this conflict. And it would be that of the Hartford Convention that would convene at the end of 1814 and boil over into the beginning of 1815. Now, the Hartford Convention itself, as I mentioned a moment ago, it begins at the end of 1814. And it's mostly going to be New England Federalists who are going to attend this convention. And why are they attending this convention? What was their main purpose? Well, up in New England, there was a lot of discontent over the war. Now, when the United States declared war, it was the narrowest vote to declare war in America's history. And most of the discontent came from the American Northwest because many of these American Northeast, mainly because these New Englanders, they were mainly merchants. And they heavily traded with the British, and the war would have a very negative impact on their local economies. And so they opposed the war, calling it Mr. Madison's War. And in 1814, that hadn't changed. They had yet to provide any troops for the American cause. And by the end of 1814, with the war continuing, with word arriving that Washington had been burned to the ground, many of these Federalists had had enough. They would call for a convening of a convention to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution, mainly to diminish the power of the Republicans, who they believe were grossly overrepresented within Congress because of things like the Three-Fifths Clause and so on and so forth. And they will eventually create 7 amendments that they want added to the Constitution. And there were whispers at this convention. I want to say just whispers. It won't be their formal platform. That if these amendments weren't adopted, that New England should just secede away from the United States and perhaps become an entity of England once again. And so, it's no surprise that Madison would actually send troops out to oversee the developments of this convention. But anyways, nonetheless, by the beginning of 1815, they would have their 7 proposed amendments, and they would send them off to the nation's capital, where they would arrive in February of 1815. But there's a problem with this. When news of this, these amendments arrive in the nation's capital, word of the Battle of New Orleans, the military victory at the Battle of New Orleans, as well as word of the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, had arrived as well. The Republicans are not going to be any interested, if they had not been before, in listening to these Federalist amendments. And they're just going to basically laugh in their face, because all the arguments they were making, trying to bring about an end to the war, adding these amendments, well, it didn't matter now. The war was over. And it will be that this Hartford Convention is significant because it was the formal end, or I should say not the formal end, but the final nail in the coffin for the death of the Federalist Party. But anyways, we'll talk more about the death of the Federalist Party when we get to our next lecture over the era of good feelings. But anyways, now that word had arrived in Washington, D.C. of the end of the war, let's talk about the end of the conflict and its legacies. Because moving forward, the War of 1812 is going to have significant impacts on America's national development, because several things will be resolved. First, out on the frontier, we'll see Americans no longer have to fear the British funding Native American raiding efforts. And this will spur westward expansion. Two, there will be lingering consequences from this conflict. America, who was completely ill-prepared because they did not have the infrastructure, they did not have a national bank, they did not have a strong manufacturing sector, well, they're going to begin to develop these things. And that will help spur westward expansion and also help spur the creation of a market-based economy that will help the United States grow eventually into a major global power. Now, as far as the legacies for all those who were involved, the Americans, they will view this as a major victory. Especially after the Battle of New Orleans, it proved that they could stand toe-to-toe with the British. And even with the Treaty of Ghent ending the war in a draw, Americans were they're very proudful of this conflict. Mainly because they had taken on the world's mightiest nation and fought them to a draw. This will instill a sense of nationalism that will boil over in the days after the conflict, which we'll talk about next time. However, the war outside of this will be largely forgotten by all sides. And the Native Americans, they will remember this war because it was the beginning of the end. Tecumseh had been killed during this conflict. And with his death, there would be no prospect for a pan-Indian alliance in the future. And it would also only mean the beginning of a period of almost 8 decades of eventual subjugation and Indian removal. Top of that, for the British, they will forget about this war. It was a sideshow to the big show, if you will, the Napoleonic Wars. And meanwhile, the Canadians look on it as a great war to where they repelled the American invaders. But anyways, for us, significantly, this war, as mentioned a moment ago, will have significant consequences, which will see impact the nation as they enter and transition into peace. But we'll talk about that in the next video. But anyways, that brings us to the end of our discussion over the War of 1812. And before we end this video, just like always, make sure you go out, complete all outstanding assignments. Make sure that you read the corresponding readings as well as chapters within the textbook to this lecture. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe. I'll see you all next time.